Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with me to listen to my talk. So, as mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about using ArcGIS to analyze ephemeral nearshore hardbottom for mitigation requirements. So, before I can get into the how, I need to talk to you about what is hardbottom. Hardbottom is the rocky substrate that occurs on our continental shelves. This hard surface is where our sessile organisms like to attach themselves and flourish, creating a hard-bottom community. Usually these are algae, sponges, soft coral, and hard corals. Ecologically, these areas are important because they provide refuge for the mobile organisms that utilize the continental shelf. Because of their location, they are vulnerable to sediment accretion. On the shelf, there are three types of hard bottom, and that is spatially where they occur, and that's what makes them distinct. The first type is nearshore hard bottom. This occurs right at your shoreline out to about 4 meters, and it's highly ephemeral. So what that means is, due to current and wave action, it's constantly being covered and uncovered by sediment. Because of this, the organisms that utilize that habitat type have become adapted to rapid recolonization of those areas. Our next type is intermediate hard bottom. These are a little bit further out, so they're not as susceptible to the wave and current sediment movement, so they're not as ephemeral. Because of this, they're more stable, so you get a more diverse habitat in that community. Lastly, we have our most persistent and our most stable and larger organisms in our offshore hard bottom. This is because they're in that deeper depth, so they're not getting that wave action, and the geomorphology in front of them is kind of acting like a sand trap and protecting them from sediment accretion. So why do we have to mitigate for hard bottom? It's because we have to renourish our beaches in Florida. We have about 825 miles of sandy coastline that's vital to the state economy and the environment. About half of those are critically eroded. So we go out and we permit that we're going to place new sediment on these areas to increase the sand and stabilize that beach area that's eroding and reduce that erosion rate. They also play an incredibly important role as our first line of defense for natural disasters. A stable beach will protect you much better from that storm surge action that you get, for instance, with a hurricane, than one that's critically eroded. When you go to permit a beach renourishment activity, the DEP is who you go to. And they require us to quantify the type and the amount of hard bottom that is going to be impacted. So they've come up with this standard operation procedure manual that actually lists different types of impacts to this hard bottom environment. So there's 6 here, but they actually sort of go hand in hand. A direct impact is whenever we're actually placing sediment into the project template and we're instantaneously covering that hard bottom environment. A secondary impact would be once the sediment is placed and it naturally settles out to where it's going to lay, it might gradually cover the currently exposed hard bottom environment. Then we have permitted and unpermitted impacts. These are separated because the permitted is anything that we've anticipated before we do the project and we've already mitigated for. Unpermitted are when after we've placed the project and our biologists have gone out and they're doing their biological monitoring the years after the project and they're finding accretion where we didn't expect it. That's a problem, and it's an unpermitted and unmitigated for impact. They also categorize these impacts as permanent or temporary. Permanent means that during our biological monitoring, we haven't seen that accretion move at all. That hard bottom is now buried and it's not going to be re-exposed. We don't expect it to be re-exposed. We also have temporary on the flip side, and that's where we might cover the hard bottom for maybe 1 year after the project, and then the next year it's exposed again and becomes a viable habitat. So now I'm going to go into how we actually analyze the hard bottom for the mitigation. So the first thing we have to do is determine where these resources are within our project area. There are several ways that we do this. The first is a diver delineated edge. This is where our marine biologists go out into the field and they take a towed GPS with them and they swim along the edge of the hard bottom and they take a GPS point like every second and you kind of collect that line. So you can see to the right here, I have some aerial imagery of the east coast of Florida. And we're a little spoiled because we have pretty nice water, great water clarity. And you can see right here, this hard structure. That is actually a pretty good amount of hard bottom that is currently exposed in this imagery, as well as this sort of rubbly area here that is also exposed hard bottom, but it's not as large of the area offshore. Which leads me into our next type of remote sensing of the hard bottom, where we're doing an aerial interpretation. This is where we're just looking at the aerial and determining this area appears to be hard bottom and delineating it out, as well as this area. So you would just go up and in GIS, heads up digitize these areas. We also do geophysical surveys. These are important. These would be like your multi-beam or your side scan sonar, and they would be run along that near shore edge to determine not only where the exposed hard bottom is, but also where there might be hard bottom that's under that thin veneer layer of sediment, which means it has potential to be exposed in the very near future. And then in conjunction with the remote sensing, we will do bounce dives. And this is where our biologists go out and they just check and make sure our interpretation of the geophysical surveys, as well as the aerial interpretations, are correct, that we haven't misinterpreted and called something like this hard bottom when it's not actually hard bottom. So, as I mentioned before, there's a near shore and an intermediate zone of hard bottom, and that's based on how close it is to the shoreline and the water depth. I actually have a series on the right there just to show you how this changes over time. It's a series of 3 consecutive years of hard bottom. So you could see in that first year, we had hard bottom out here, and now the sediment has moved and covered that area. And this is just 1 year later. And then here, more of that kind of rubble hard bottom has been exposed, as well as a very large solid area very close to our mean high water area right there. Then in the third year, more sediment has moved around. So you've actually kind of had a lot of this rubbly area get a little bit buried again, and then that area that was prior looked like a sand channel, now we have hard bottom exposure. So that's what we're trying to analyze and mitigate for when we're permitting a beach nourishment. So once we have our project area, the first thing we look at is persistence, which again, that is just how long is that hard bottom community lasting over the years before it's buried again. This is done with a fairly simple analysis in ArcGIS using Model Builder, and it's taking whatever number of years of hard bottom data you have and you've decided to analyze, and stepping it through a clip process to determine which areas stay exposed. So I have a quick little example up here, taking the 2003 hard bottom and using the next year, the 2004, to clip it. And whatever stays inside that clip is considered exposed in both of those years. So then you can take that 2-year persistence and feed it into the clip again, and use the next year, the 2005, and clip the persistence of the 2-year with that to get a 3-year persistence, and go through the time step. Depending on the area of where you are on the continental shelf, the ephemeral nature is highly variable. It has to do, again, with the wave action as well as sediment transports through currents. So in the example I'm about to show you, this was an analysis of 10 years of hard bottom. And you can see this little black box here and that little red dot. That is the only area of consecutive persistence we had. And that's because this little blue line here was the 2009 year of hard bottom, and it was really a year where a lot of sediment had moved into the area and had covered a lot of that hard bottom resource. So it was really the limiting factor to persistence in that hard bottom. Then we look at the max extent. This is an analysis of any hard bottom over the time frame that we're looking at that has been exposed at any given time. So it kind of gives you the idea of where all this hard bottom historically has occurred. Again, it's a relatively simple analysis inside ArcGIS using a merge with all your data sets that you're analyzing and then dissolving them so you just get a nice visual of where all that hard bottom occurs. And the results of that are going to look something like this. That transparent red area that we're looking at here, at some point in the time frame that we analyzed, was exposed and viable habitat for the sessile organisms and could potentially become a viable community. So it's constantly changing out here. Now, traditionally, the DEP has us look at those two things, and then our biologists will go and have a discussion with the permitting community, and they will determine what year we should analyze of the hard bottom. Usually it's the most recent exposure year, but if we had an instance like, say, a storm that covered a lot of hard bottom, it might not represent what is actually going on in that environment. So we might do a year before the storm or something along those lines. Once that decision is made, we take that hard bottom into ArcGIS, and we do another simple spatial analysis where we overlay the project template. So here I have the construction toe of fill. This means this is the immediate area where all the sediment that we're placing is going to be dumped and pushed around and built into that template. So using the split by line tool, I can then assign this hard bottom as a direct impact, and I can quantify how many acres are being impacted by our fill template. This is important because mitigation is expensive. We have to mitigate for any hard bottom that we impact, and it runs about $1 million per acre to mitigate for a hard bottom. Next, we'll look at the secondary impacts. This is where our engineers modeled that their design is going to naturally settle and become part of the environment, and we don't expect it to settle out just because it's settling from the placement. So they'll give us an equilibrium toe of fill, and anything that is impacted within this area will be quantified as a secondary indirect impact and mitigate it for. Again, split by a polyline and assign that acreage as that type of impact. Then those can be fed into the UMAM, and it can tell us how many acres do we now have to build for artificial reef, and how much is it going to cost. So the prior analysis is not very good for this highly ephemeral area. It's sort of short-sighted. It's looking at one time frame. So we wanted to try to do something better. So we wanted to look at a temporal sort of analysis over time. So when we're monitoring these projects after they've been placed, we are required to look at them for about 3 years. So what we decided to do was to use the Delft 3D model to create areas of accretion for the 3 years after we placed the project. So sort of predict where those areas of accretion were going to occur, and then we would be able to better analyze impacts on the hard bottom. So the Delft 3D is based on bathymetry, and it uses waves and it uses currents, and it has a special model where it actually will analyze sediment movement, and it's a feedback loop. So every time the sediment moves, it actually updates the bathymetry that you're looking at and changes it, and then feeds that back in, and it will build it. So it's a pretty advanced model that we like to use, and the results of that are all these different areas of impact. So these are all different types of where we expect sedimentation to lay and stay, accrete in that area. Then I took that into ArcGIS and I built an impact feature class. And that is basically where I said, okay, I have an accretion polygon here, and then I have in year 1, and then I have another accretion polygon in year 2. So that's going to be a 2-year impact. And then depending on where it fell would tell me whether it was a direct or indirect impact. Then to make it more comprehensive, we assigned a zone for the impact. So it either fell within our CTOF or inside our ETOF. We were also kind of required by permitting to analyze those unpermitted impacts. You sort of have to anticipate, will anything occur outside of our project area? So when we model, we were seeing some impacts in updrift, downdrift, and beyond the ETOF, more seaward. So we classified those into those zones as well. Once we did that, we decided we were going to look at multiple years of hard bottom, since the area is constantly shifting and changing. So that way we had an idea of if any of that hard bottom became exposed in that 3-year time frame, how it would potentially be impacted where the sediment was laying. And typically in a beach nourishment project, before you actually build, you have multiple alternatives. And then the client will choose the alternative based on the cost of building it as well as the cost of mitigating for it. So once I had this feature class of impacts built, I took multiple years of hard bottom and I ran a tabulate intersection. And that's a tool in the spatial analysis box that allows you to basically say, I would like to look at this area and I'd like to take the zones and tell me what type of impact occurs in that area and how much. Because there was multiple years, I set up a batch process and let it run overnight. That was great because it spit out all these tables of impacts in acreage. The next thing we did was take those acres and give it to our biologists in an Excel where they created a time average. So because you can see the impact of exposed hard bottom changed, we could get an exposed average of what was being impacted over the time frame that we looked at, which in this instance was 10 years. Once they did their magic in the marine biology cell and came up with a time average, they fed it into UMAM, and they were able to look at the different types of impact and determine how much hard bottom you actually had to mitigate for, which in turn allowed us to estimate a cost of mitigation. And again, that was over several different alternatives. So you can see, based on the alternatives, these costs can vary slightly or significantly. So what this does is it gives us a snapshot of a complex ecological process. This is highly ephemeral, and we're looking at it annually. The truth of the matter is, these areas, that's how much have changed in a year. Realistically, the ephemeral nature of this hard bottom could be monthly, it could be daily. You don't really know unless you're out there constantly observing it. While we were happy with our model results, it's hard to fit those model results into the current mitigation policy. How do you determine different types of temporary impact and the cost of them? Right now we have 2 types, and they have different values to them. And lastly, I would love to automate this for efficiency, especially when it spit out a lot of those tables and I had to put it into a different Excel. That was not the most efficient way to do that, so I would like to write a script that would automatically do that for me next time. So in conclusion, this model, impact analysis, is a better representation of the ecology of that area and what's actually occurring on our continental shelf. It's a step in the right direction. ArcGIS products allowed for a nice spatial temporal analysis, a model to be built fairly easily. If we had better data, it could become an even better model. And better modeling will allow us to better understand those environments, which in turn will allow us to manage these environments better, because beach renourishment is never going to end if we want to protect our critically eroded shorelines. Any questions?